Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. At its peak, the British Empire wasn't just the largest empire in history, it was the most influential. Spanning continents and oceans, it governed over a quarter of the Earth's population and territory. But behind the sheer scale lies a dramatic story of ambition, conquest, resistance, and eventual retreat. So how did a small island nation come to dominate vast parts of the globe in just a few centuries? And why, after reaching such staggering heights, did it all unravel? In this video, we'll trace the meteoric rise and the complex fall of the British Empire through colonization and commerce, revolutions and rebellions, world wars and independence, movements. From India to Africa, from the Americas to the Pacific, this is a story of power, conflict, and legacy. Watch as we bring this global saga to life, with dramatic reenactments, rare historical footage, and animated maps that reveal how the empire expanded, and how it ultimately collapsed. The origins of the British Empire trace back to a time of immense transformation in Europe. As feudalism began to collapse in the late Middle Ages, a new world order was emerging, driven by trade, exploration, and the rise of powerful nation-states. Maritime empires like Spain and Portugal were the first to launch global voyages of conquest, setting the stage for England to follow. Under Henry VII, England began cautiously entering the race for overseas expansion. In 1497, explorer John Cabot set sail under the English flag and reached the coast of Newfoundland. Though this early voyage didn't lead to immediate colonization, it marked the beginning of England's imperial ambitions. The real turning point came a century later, with the founding of the East India Company in 1600. This wasn't a government project, but a private corporation with extraordinary powers, granted the ability to wage war, sign treaties, and control vast regions in the name of profit. It was here that economic imperialism was born, as trade and capitalism became tools of empire. Meanwhile, England began planting the seeds of colonial settlement. The Roanoke colony, established in the 1580s, mysteriously disappeared. But by 1607, Jamestown was founded in what is now Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. Not long after, England seized valuable territories in the Caribbean, like Barbados and Jamaica, which became engines of wealth through sugar plantations and enslaved labor. These early efforts were fragmented and experimental, but together they laid the foundation for a global empire, built not just by force but through commerce, colonization, and the pursuit of profit. The seeds had been sown, and soon the British Empire would begin to take root across the world. As the 17th and 18th centuries unfolded, the British Empire expanded rapidly, driven by trade, war, and an increasingly powerful navy. What had begun as scattered colonies was now evolving into a complex and global system of economic exploitation and imperial control. In the Caribbean, Britain's sugar colonies became some of the wealthiest and most brutal corners of the empire. Islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Kitts produced vast quantities of sugar, a commodity so valuable it was called white gold. But this wealth came at a horrific cost. These plantations relied on the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly transporting millions of Africans to work under brutal conditions. The British economy became deeply entwined with slavery, shaping both wealth and moral contradiction at the heart of the empire. Meanwhile, in India, the British East India Company was transforming from a trading venture into a ruling power. A pivotal moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive led company forces to a decisive victory over the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This marked the beginning of British political domination in India and laid the groundwork for direct imperial rule in the century to come. Across the Atlantic, Britain had established 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. These colonies were diverse, from Puritan Massachusetts to slaveholding Virginia, but all played a role in Britain's global strategy. Tensions were already rising, but for now, they remained a vital part of the empire. The British also clashed with their European rivals in a series of global conflicts, most notably the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. Often called the First World War, this massive struggle saw fighting in Europe, the Americas, India, and beyond. Britain emerged victorious, gaining Canada from France and further consolidating control in India. The war cemented Britain's position as the dominant global power. The Royal Navy was the beating heart of the British Empire. More than just a military force, it was a global instrument of control, commerce, and expansion. At a time when the seas were the lifelines of empire, naval superiority meant the ability to dictate the flow of goods, ideas, and armies. The Royal Navy ensured that British merchant ships could safely travel from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the textile hubs of India, and the fur traders of Canada back to Britain's ports, generating massive wealth for the empire's elite. But its role went beyond protection. The Navy also enforced colonial trade laws under the mercantile system, a theory that saw colonies not as independent entities, but as tools to enrich the mother country. Under mercantilism, Britain restricted its colonies from trading freely with other nations. Instead, they were required to export raw materials, like cotton, tobacco, sugar, and tea, exclusively to Britain. In return, they had to import British-made goods. This created a cycle of dependency and economic dominance where Britain reaped the profits and the colonies remained resource suppliers and captive markets. This model was intensely profitable for Britain. It helped fuel the Industrial Revolution and built cities, institutions, and fortunes, but it also sowed deep frustration and inequality. Colonists chafed under laws they had no hand in making, while laborers, especially enslaved people, paid the ultimate price for the empire's prosperity. The Royal Navy, once a symbol of protection, also became a symbol of oppression, used to suppress revolts, enforce blockades, and crush dissent. By the end of the 18th century, the British Empire appeared unstoppable. It held vast territories, controlled global trade routes, and dictated the terms of international commerce. But under the surface, resistance was growing. In North America, colonists were beginning to demand independence. In India, local rulers were uneasy about the East India Company's growing power. And across the empire, the moral contradictions of slavery, economic exploitation, and foreign domination were becoming harder to ignore. Thus, the very forces that built the empire, naval power, economic control, and colonial expansion, also planted the seeds of its undoing. The empire had reached a peak, but change was on the horizon. Revolution, rebellion, and reform would soon test the foundations of Britain's global dominance. During the mid to late 19th century, the British Empire reached the zenith of its global power, a period often referred to as the high noon of WWI Empire. It was an age defined by confidence, conquest, and control, with Queen Victoria as its symbolic figurehead. In 1876, she was crowned Empress of India, a title that reflected the empire's pride in its most prized colony and solidified Britain's claim to rule over millions of subjects across Asia. This period also saw an aggressive push into Africa, known as the Scramble for Africa. Driven by a mix of economic ambition, strategic competition with European rivals, and a sense of racial and cultural superiority, Britain expanded rapidly across the continent. Territories like Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, and Nigeria were brought under British control, often through military force or deceptive treaties. The 1884-85 Berlin Conference, though hosted by Germany, symbolized how European powers, including Britain, carved up Africa with little regard for indigenous boundaries or sovereignty. Economically, this era was marked by the Pax Britannica, or British peace, a term used to describe the relative global stability enforced by the Royal Navy and British diplomatic power. With its naval supremacy unchallenged, Britain could dominate the world's sea lanes and global trade routes. British goods, currency, and influence reached every corner of the world. London became the financial center of the globe, and English emerged as the language of commerce and empire. Technological advancements further reinforced British dominance. The telegraph shrank communication times between colonies and London from months to mere hours. Railways and steamships revolutionized transportation, allowing for the swift movement of troops, resources, and goods across vast distances. In many colonies, railway lines were built not just for development, but to serve imperial interests, moving raw materials to ports for export and connecting administrative centers to enforce British control. Underlying all of this expansion was a powerful and controversial belief system, the ideology of the civilizing mission. Many British politicians, writers, and missionaries believed it was their moral duty to bring Western civilization, Christianity, education, law, and modernity to what they deemed backward peoples. This sense of British exceptionalism justified conquest in the name of progress, masking the economic exploitation and violent suppression that often accompanied imperial rule. Perhaps nothing captured this imperial confidence better than the famous phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." It wasn't just a geographic observation, it was a declaration of Britain's unmatched reach and presumed permanence. From the Caribbean to Australia, from India to Canada, British authority was seen as eternal. Yet even in this golden age, cracks were forming. Resistance movements were stirring. Colonized peoples were learning the language and tools of their oppressors, and soon they would begin to turn them against the empire itself. The high noon of empire would not last forever. By the late 19th century, cracks were beginning to show in the once unassailable foundation of the British Empire. As Britain expanded its global reach, it faced increasing resistance and rebellion from the very peoples it sought to control. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny, was a pivotal moment in this shift. The rebellion, sparked by grievances over British military practices, cultural insensitivity, and economic exploitation, was a violent and far-reaching uprising. Though the British were ultimately able to crush the rebellion, it marked the beginning of a long and bitter struggle for Indian independence. In its aftermath, Britain formally took direct control of India, replacing the East India Company with the British Raj, but the seeds of resistance had already been sown. Nationalist sentiments began to rise across India, and the struggle for independence would define the next century. At the same time, Britain faced growing unrest within its own borders, particularly in Ireland. The Irish had long resisted British rule, and by the late 19th century, calls for Home Rule, the movement for Irish self-government, intensified. The Irish believed they were being unfairly taxed and exploited by the British, while their cultural identity and Catholic religion were suppressed by Protestant English rule. Despite widespread Irish support, the British government consistently denied Home Rule, leading to deepening tensions. The Irish Easter Rising of 1916 and the eventual Irish War of Independence in the early 20th century would finally lead to the partition of Ireland and the creation of the Irish Free State, a blow to British control on the island. Far beyond the British Isles, the empire also faced significant anti-imperial sentiment in places like South Africa. The Boer Wars, 1899 to 1902, fought between British forces and the Boer settlers, descendants of Dutch colonists, were a stark example of resistance to imperial rule. The Boers fiercely opposed British control over their territories, especially after the discovery of gold and diamonds in the region, which brought British imperial interests into direct conflict with the Boer settlers' desire for independence. The wars were brutal and marked by guerrilla tactics and scorched earth policies. Though the British emerged victorious, the Boer Wars galvanized anti-imperial sentiment both within the colonies and in Britain, where the high human and financial cost of the wars led to growing disillusionment with imperialism. Meanwhile, nationalist movements began to gain momentum across the empire. In India, figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru began organizing mass movements calling for self-rule. In Egypt, the 1919 revolution saw Egyptians demanding independence from British rule, and in Africa, many colonies began to organize politically and push back against colonial domination. These movements were fueled by the idea that colonized peoples had the right to self-determination, and their growing strength would soon challenge the very principles of British imperialism. As these uprisings and movements gained traction, the British Empire's ability to maintain control weakened. While the empire was still vast and powerful, it was no longer unchallenged. Resistance from within its borders and its colonies began to reshape the world's view of imperialism. The British were no longer seen as benevolent rulers, but as a foreign power clinging to outdated ideas of control. These rebellions, combined with economic pressures, would ultimately herald the end of the Age of Empire. By the early 20th century, the British Empire was facing profound challenges that would ultimately lead to its unraveling. The First World War, 1914-1918, marked a turning point for the empire, as it plunged Britain into a devastating global conflict. The war inflicted a heavy human toll, Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers and colonial troops lost their lives. Economically, the war drained Britain's resources, weakening its ability to maintain control over its vast empire. This marked the beginning of a slow and steady decline in British global power. During the interwar period, the British Empire struggled to regain its strength. But even as it attempted to rebuild, anti-colonial movements gained momentum around the world. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India and Jawaharlal Nehru became powerful voices in the fight for independence. Their nonviolent resistance and political activism inspired millions, and as British influence in India began to erode, the pressure for self-rule grew overwhelming. The British government was increasingly unable to justify its control over colonies that were clamoring for autonomy. These movements were emboldened by the aftermath of World War I, which had exposed the contradictions in Britain's imperial policies and highlighted the need for reform. The most significant moment in this process came in 1947, when India, Britain's most valuable and populous colony, gained independence. The partition of India into two separate nations, India and Pakistan, marked the formal end of the British Raj. It was a momentous event, but it also revealed the fractures within the empire, religious and ethnic divisions, as well as the brutal violence that accompanied partition, demonstrated the deep challenges of managing such a vast and diverse empire. Following the end of World War II, decolonization accelerated across the globe. The wave of independence movements spread quickly through Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. Former colonies such as Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria gained independence, signaling the collapse of European colonial dominance in Africa. By the 1960s, Britain had lost control of many of its African territories, and the Caribbean followed suit, with countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados gaining independence in the decades that followed. Meanwhile, Britain's struggle to maintain global influence was epitomized in the Suez Crisis of 1956, a pivotal moment that exposed the limits of British power. The crisis began when Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a key maritime route previously controlled by Britain and France. When Britain, France, and Israel attempted to invade Egypt in response, they faced strong opposition from both the United States and the Soviet Union, marking a clear sign of Britain's diminished status on the world stage. The failure of the Suez Crisis symbolized the end of Britain's position as a dominant global power and revealed how out of step Britain was with the new geopolitical realities of the Cold War. As Britain's global power waned, the British Empire transitioned into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies and dominions. The Commonwealth was intended to maintain a sense of unity and cooperation among former imperial territories, while allowing them full independence and sovereignty. Over time, however, it became increasingly clear that the ties between Britain and its former colonies were based more on historical connections than any actual political or economic control. The Commonwealth, while still significant in some areas, did not replace the empire's former geopolitical influence. The fall of the British Empire was not a single event, but a gradual process that unfolded over much of the 20th century. World War I and World War II weakened Britain's military and economic power, and the rise of nationalist movements in the colonies hastened decolonization. The independence of India, the wave of African independence, the loss of influence during the Suez Crisis, and the eventual transition to the Commonwealth all marked key moments in this decline. Britain's former colonies, now independent nations, went on to forge their own paths in the world, leaving behind the legacy of the British Empire, which continues to shape global politics, economics, and culture today. The legacy of the British Empire is visible in many facets of modern life, both in the countries it once ruled and within Britain itself. One of the most enduring aspects of British imperialism is the English language, which has become a global lingua franca, spoken by over 2 billion people worldwide. From India to Canada, from Africa to the Caribbean, English remains the official, or widely spoken language in many former colonies, linking the world in a way that no other language has. This linguistic legacy has created an interconnected world, particularly in business, academia, and international diplomacy. The legal systems of many former colonies are still based on British law. Common law, which was developed in England and brought to colonies like the United States, India, Australia, and several African nations, remains the foundation of their legal systems. The British emphasis on parliamentary democracy also influenced many former colonies. Parliaments modeled on the British system of government, often bicameral, with a House of Commons and an upper chamber, can be found in countries like Canada, Australia, and India. Many former colonies also adopted British customs, institutions, and practices, creating a web of political and legal traditions that tie them back to their imperial past. In Britain, the legacy of empire is visible in its population as well. Immigration from former colonies, especially from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Africa, has shaped Britain into a multicultural society. This demographic shift began in the mid-20th century as former colonies gained independence and many sought a new life in the mother country. Today, Britain is a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions, with citizens of South Asian, African, and Caribbean descent forming an integral part of British society. This diversity, while enriching the country culturally, has also led to tensions around identity, race, and immigration, especially in the face of modern debates about national identity. At the same time, the British Empire's legacy is increasingly being scrutinized in the context of colonial crimes and reparations. As awareness of the darker aspects of imperial rule grows, there has been increased debate over whether former imperial powers should compensate the countries they once controlled for the atrocities committed during colonization. Events such as the Amritsar Massacre 1919 in India, where British troops killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, or the forced labor and exploitation of African peoples in places like Kenya and Nigeria, have sparked calls for reparations and an apology from the British government. Some argue that the wealth amassed by Britain during its imperial era, much of which came at the expense of colonized peoples, should be acknowledged and compensated. Another aspect of the empire's legacy is the ongoing controversy surrounding statues and monuments to imperial figures. Statues of figures like Cecil Rhodes in South Africa or Winston Churchill in the UK have become focal points for debates about the legacy of colonialism. While these figures are celebrated by some for their roles in British history, many others see them as symbols of oppression and racism. The global Black Lives Matter movement has brought these debates into sharper focus, with calls for the removal of statues of imperial figures whose actions contributed to systemic racism and colonial violence. The debate over monuments, therefore, is a microcosm of the larger struggle to reconcile Britain's imperial past with its modern identity. The legacy of the British Empire also extends to global politics and economics. The global trading system established by the British Empire laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. British colonialism helped create the conditions for the rise of global trade networks, while the extraction of resources from colonies fueled the growth of British industry. Today, many former colonial powers continue to have significant influence over international trade, financial institutions, and political organizations, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The imperial era also contributed to the formation of modern geopolitical alliances, with former British colonies often maintaining close relationships with one another through the Commonwealth of Nations. Despite the end of formal imperial rule, the legacy of the British Empire continues to shape the modern world. From the language we speak to the political systems we live under, from the cultural diversity of nations to the ongoing struggles for justice and recognition, the empire's impact is still felt. For some, it remains a source of pride, while for others, it serves as a reminder of exploitation and inequality. The complexity of this legacy means that debates over Britain's imperial past will continue to shape conversations about history, identity, and justice for generations to come. As we look back at the rise and fall of the British Empire, it's clear that its legacy is as complex as it is vast. At its peak, the empire spanned the globe, shaping the course of history, economics, and politics. From the spread of the English language to the establishment of global trade networks, it left an indelible mark on the world. But with that legacy comes a darker side: colonial exploitation, violence, and the suppression of countless cultures and peoples. As we reflect on the empire's impact, we must ask ourselves, was it all glory or something darker? The answer perhaps lies somewhere in between, shaped by both pride and regret, progress and injustice. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of the British Empire's legacy? Was it a force for good, or is it a chapter in history best remembered for its darker aspects? Make sure to like this video if you found it insightful, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's pivotal moments.